The state of Michigan spends over $6 billion a year on transportation, yet few people think our transportation is particularly great. A sliver of those funds support more than 80 local bus, ferry, senior mobility, rail, and other non-road transportation systems. I'm here today to provide a quick overview of how Michigan funds, or too often neglects, public transportation. By way of introduction, I'm the director of Transportation Riders United, a nonprofit community organization that has been working in Michigan for nearly 25 years. We believe everyone should be able to get where they need to go, regardless of whether they drive. So we educate, advocate, mobilize for more and better public transportation and other affordable mobility options. First, we need to look briefly at why is public transit so essential. Public transit is for everyone, for our elders who want to age in place but still go out, for disabled Michiganders who want to have access and freedom, for families with only one vehicle, for young people saving up for their first car, for people seeking affordable ways to minimize their climate footprint, for workers whose car might be in the shop, for that 15-year-old on their way to their first job, for sports fans who can afford more games if they don't have to pay for parking, and for anyone who is looking to avoid outrageous gas prices and insurance rates, especially for our essential workers. This adds up to some half of Michiganders who want or need some better options. And public transportation is everywhere. Michigan has 77 public transit agencies that serve every county across Michigan. Some names you might know, others are under the radar, but every one is a lifeline for their community. Public transit connects to everything, whether access to opportunities, to enable options, to make our state more affordable, safe, convenient, and attractive. Transit touches so many things that we all care about. Now let's get into how public transportation is funded here in Michigan. While every transit agency has a different funding mix, most public transportation funds come from a few main sources. The largest share is generally local funds, which are most often voter-approved property taxes. This is actually the one government expenditure that voters have to affirmatively approve every few years. And here in Michigan, voters have approved 90% of local transit millage questions. This is something people want. Local funding also includes bus fares, contracts, ads, and other local revenue. State funds are also a critically important component that we'll talk about in just a moment. And federal funds provide both some rural operating funds and are mostly for capital costs like buying new buses. When any one source decreases, that means agencies must either cut service that people need or try to raise other sources, none of which can happen very fast, if at all. So Michigan has traditionally funded transportation through two main sources, the gas tax, the diesel tax, as well as vehicle registration fees. And those go into what's called the Michigan Transportation Fund, the MTF. And in terms of where that's spent, 90% of the MTF funds our roads. That's local, county, and state roads all across the state of Michigan. Now, I'm not going to get into the formula for how those are divided, but again, 90% of the MTF goes to roads. And then a remainder goes to the CTF, the Comprehensive Transportation Fund, after some earmarks to MDOT administration and debt service and a couple other areas. So up to 10% of this MTF can go to the CTF. And after some administrative costs, those go into local bus operating, which is what actually enables those 77 bus agencies to operate every day. It also goes into buying new buses, into rail and intercity services, and then other special services like several of the ferries and other important transit opportunities. There is another source, the auto-related sales tax. The Constitution says up to 25% of which can go to the CTF. Unfortunately, we've been investing less than 7% of that actually into the CTF. And that's traditionally how Michigan has funded transportation. Now, after decades of very, very flat funding for both roads and for transit, In 2015, a measure was passed the legislature passed a measure that would increase investment in the roads. And a tiny bit went to transit, but not much. So since 2017, there were some earmarks that went straight to roads and some general funds, $600 million a year going straight from the general fund into local roads. So actually, the CTF has been getting barely 7% of the MTF. And again, these are choices that our legislators make on how we want to divide the revenue that we're all investing into our state. By skipping the CTF in past transportation funding deals, public transit has lost millions. The full bars show this, what the CTF would have received if it had gotten the full 10% of traditional formula. The solid red bar shows how much the CTF actually received. Bypassing transit has cost close to $100 million a year for the past several years, a devastating gap for those public transit agencies who are barely making ends meet. In addition to understanding the CTF, it's important to look at what this means for individual agencies. Local bus operating, LBO, is in many ways the most important line in the budget for transit agencies. Transit agencies are split into two buckets, urban and non-urban. There are about 20 urban agencies serving Michigan's larger cities and metro areas, and 50-some non-urban areas serving mostly rural areas, as well as some smaller cities and towns. State funding is provided on a reimbursement basis based on how much each of these agencies spend. And they can get up to 60% of their eligible expenses reimbursed for the rural agencies, and the urban agencies can get up to 50%. Each year, eligible expenses are totaled, and the potential reimbursement is calculated. But for decades, the LBO budget has fallen far short of full funding. So these potential reimbursements are cut down by an equal amount based on what the legislature and the governor actually invest, and then the actual reimbursement rate is calculated. Because of that flat funding, non-urban agencies aren't getting that full 60%, but in 2024, got about 35%. And the urban agencies are getting about 30%. Based on projections of what the governor has proposed, next year's agencies are at risk of getting just 31 and 26% of their expenses reimbursed. The state used to cover nearly half of that cost. And so it's really devastating for these agencies to try to figure out where to fill in that gap. It's also important to note, when LBO is a flat amount divided among 77 different agencies, that means when a few agencies grow or boost their local investments, as regularly happens, all the other agencies receive a little bit less. The governor's budget proposal remains purely flat for transit, even down in a few areas, and that's hugely problematic because costs are rising. This is what happened to the LBO rate over the last 25 years. At one point, the state covered half the costs of running local bus service, investing gas taxes, registration fees, and some sales tax revenue to support this important service statewide. But after decades of flat funding, failed to keep up with inflation, let alone the increasing needs of an aging population. Reimbursement levels have hit their lowest ever. If your salary didn't change for years, yet your rent and your groceries and your gas costs are up 10 to 15% every year, how long can you keep trimming before you just can't do it? That's where a lot of our transit agencies are at. A flat LBO budget means a major cut for transit agencies, the lowest reimbursement rate ever. Now let's make sure we have a good understanding of what the needs are for transportation funding. The priority focus certainly needs to be on ensuring that the current transit agencies have what they need to provide the services that people are depending on every day. The LBO is what is enabling seniors to get to doctor's appointments, students to get to classes, workers to get to their jobs. This is a lifeline across Michigan. So we really do need the state to invest the full 50% reimbursement rate for urban and 60% reimbursement rate for non-urban agencies. Now that'll need about $440 million in the FY26 budget, which is about 20 million more than the current funding levels. We also recognize that public transit is not where it needs to be in the state of Michigan. We need to invest in new and expanded transit, in transformational transit like rapid transit in urban areas, airport expresses, job connectors all across the state, expanded rail and intercity bus service connecting between our communities. And that's going to require at least another $200 to $300 million a year from the state. That's where we need to be. So there's a few ways that the legislature can invest in transit. First, we strongly urge that public transit be included in any road funding deal that might be considered. It is essential that we use the long-standing formula that includes 10% for transit of all of that transportation revenue. We're excited to see that the governor's proposal, the My Road Ahead plan, does fund the full transportation system. And that would raise an essential $250 million for the CTF, a huge step in the right direction. There are also other ways to invest in transit. There are ways to shift funding. The legislature should certainly consider ways that funding could be moved, restoring the CTF's full 10% to the MTF by removing those earmarks and putting that back through the funding formula, increasing the transit funding from 7 to close to 9.5 or 10%. Now that might have an impact on road funding or other areas. There's also the auto-related sales tax that should absolutely be increased from the current 6.9% to that constitutionally set level of 25%. Now that again would impact the general fund. Anytime you're shifting funding from one place to another, that does have impacts elsewhere, but all sorts of options should be considered. And we strongly urge the governor and the legislature to look at new funding sources. That could be sales tax for transportation. Now that would require constitutional amendment, so it would be a long-term solution, but that is how a lot of states fund public transit. Things like an airport parking surcharge, or taxing vaping products, or delivery fees or surcharges on ride hailing. There's a wide range of opportunities for new funding. But in order to make sure that our transportation system has the funding it needs, we've got to figure out how to make that funding happen. So in conclusion, transit is essential for Michiganders. The need is increasing as our population is aging and as things are getting so much more expensive. We have 77 amazing agencies providing essential rides every single day, but they are severely underfunded and some are really in a crisis level. Michigan used to fund half the costs of local bus service, allocating nearly 10% of the gas taxes and the Michigan transportation revenues to transit costs. But Michigan hasn't meaningfully increased transit funding in decades. We've failed to even keep up with rising costs. So Michigan needs a funding boost of $200 million every year to restore that essential funding, and another $200 to $300 million to expand and start providing the public transit that all of our communities want and need to see. So thank you so much for considering this. We look forward to the ongoing conversation across the state of Michigan on how will we improve public transportation in Michigan.